Welcome to this episode of Crash Course History. Today we will be covering World War I. It wasn't the most destructive war or the first total war, and it certainly wasn't the war to end all wars, but it was the war to change all wars. World War I changed our outlook. It normalized cynicism and irony, which are two dominant schools of thought in our modern world.
Most people think of World War I as a tragedy because it didn't need to happen and didn't really accomplish much, except for creating social and economic conditions that made World War II possible. The immediate cause, of course, was the assassination of Sarajevo of the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand on June 28, 1914, by a Bosnian Serb nationalist named Gavrilo Princip. So Franz Ferdinand wasn't particularly well liked by his uncle, the Emperor Franz Joseph, but even so, the assassination led Austria to issue an ultimatum to Serbia, whereupon Serbia accepted some, but not all, of Austria's demands, leading Austria to declare war against Serbia and then Russia. Due to its alliances with the Serbs that mobilized its army, Germany, because it had an alliance with Austria, told Russia to stop mobilizing, which Russia failed to do. So then Germany mobilized its own army, declared war on Russia, cemented an alliance with the Ottomans, and then declared war on France.
Germany's war plan, the Schlieffen Plan, required that it invade France in the most expedient way possible via Belgium, and Great Britain was a friend of Belgium, so they declared war on Germany. So by August 4th, all the major powers of Europe are at war with each other. By the end of the month, Japan, honoring its alliance with Britain, would be at war with Germany and Austria as well. So there were many opportunities not to mobilize and declare war, none of which were taken. Some blame the web of alliances itself, which is what Woodrow Wilson tried to fix with the League of Nations. Some blame Russia, the first big country to mobilize. Some blame Germany for its inflexibility of the Schlieffen Plan. Leninists claim war grew out of imperialism and was fueled by capitalist rivalries, and others claim it was a war between Germany's radical modernism and Britain's traditional conservatism. The alliance system and the cultural belief that war was, in general, good for nations proved to hold some blame in the grand scheme of things. War helped define who was them and who was us, and doing that strengthened the idea of us. And before World War I, war was perceived to be necessary and often even glorious.
The trench warfare on the Western Front is most famous for its brutal futility. Great Britain and France on one side, Germany on the other, with no man's land in between. World War I was a writer's war, and there's a lot of metaphorical resonance in living men digging holes where they would die. The lines of trenches on the Western Front covered only about 400 miles as the crow flies, but because of the endless zigzagging, the trenches themselves may have run as much as 25,000 miles.
The stalemate of trench warfare wasn't seen on every front, especially at the beginning of the war. There was a lot of offensive movement, especially in the initial German strikes, especially on the Eastern Front. The Germans were pretty successful against the Russians, who had a large but pretty hapless army.
Brings up an important point. World War I featured combatants from around the world. Britain's army especially included soldiers from India, Africa, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, who was just happy to be invited. Africans served with the French, and for a lot of these people, their experiences helped build nationalist movements when survivors returned home after the war.
For most soldiers, there was nothing glamorous or heroic about this war. For the British, for example, the trenches were two things above all, wet and smelly. The dampness came from the fact that the British trenches were the wettest part of Flanders. The smell was mainly decomposing flesh.
On the upside, soldiers were at least rarely hungry, and there was a lot of food from home, which is worth underscoring because it reminds us that home wasn't very far away. Even for the British, at their closest, the front was only 7 miles from England. They could read newspapers from London one day later than Londoners could.
While going over the top of trenches to cross no man's land and attack the enemy trench is what lights our romantic imagination. Most soldiers' lives were dominated by fear of shelling. According to a journal published by French soldiers, there's nothing more horrible in war than being shelled. It's a form of torture that the soldier can't see the end of. Suddenly, he's afraid of being buried alive. The man stays put in his hole, helplessly hoping for a miracle.
Although soldiers then, as now, lived under conditions it's difficult to imagine, there was more than even the threat of death to distress them. According to German officer Ernst Junger, it was not Danger, however extreme, that depresses the spirit of men so much as over-fatigue and wretched conditions. And for most soldiers, especially the French and British, the pay for their efforts was pitiful. So why do they even keep fighting? Duty, nationalism, loyalty to comrades, and fear of being shot for desertion all played a role.
But so did alcohol. As one British medical officer said, "Had it not been for the rum ration, I do not think we should have won the war." Ernst Junger also remarked on the propensity of soldiers to drink their troubles away. Though 10 out of 12 had fallen, still the last two, as sure as death, were to be found on the first evening of rest over the bottle, drinking a silent health to their dead companions.
The war itself was incredibly destructive. Over 15 million people were killed and over 20 million wounded. In France, 13.3% of the male population between the age of 15 and 49 died in the war. The war also saw a lot of civilians die, especially in the Ottoman Empire, where more than 2 million of the 3 million people killed were non-combatants.
But like so many other wars, World War I's most efficient killer was disease. Dysentery, typhus, and cholera were rampant, and otherwise minor injuries would prove fatal when gangrene set in. 25% of arm wounds among German soldiers were fatal, and that's not even to mention the famous influenza epidemic that broke out toward the end of the war, which killed 3 times as many people as the war itself.
The main reason the war was so deadly was the combination of new technology and outdated tactics. While we may think about tanks, airplanes, and poison gas, all of which made their debut in the First World War, the 2 most devastating technologies were American: machine guns and barbed wire. Attempting to march in lines towards an enemy's trench, soldiers of both sides were mowed down by machine gun fire.
The Treaty of Versailles, which ended World War I, fixed the blame for the war in Germany, which proved ruinous to the German economy and destructive to its political institutions. And unless you're really nostalgic for totalitarian communism, you've got to say that World War I was also a disaster for Russia because it facilitated the rise of the Bolsheviks.
The Russian Revolution had 2 phases. In the first phase, called the February Revolution, because, get this, it occurred in February, army mutinies and civil unrest forced the overthrow of the Romanov dynasty, which had been in power in Russia for what had seemed like forever. The monarchy was replaced by a provisional government led eventually by Alexander Kerensky, which made the terrible decision to keep Russia in the war, which led to the October Revolution, so called because it happened in October, in which Vladimir Lenin and his Bolsheviks took over, famously promising the Russian people peace, bread, and land.
Lenin's first big achievement was signing a separate peace with Germany and getting Russia out of the war, which was helpful to him since he needed to fight a civil war that wouldn't end until 1922. This might have helped Germany too, except the US entered the war on the side of the British and the French, which led to another outcome of the war: increased geopolitical influence for the United States. The U.S. was already becoming an economic power, and being able to avoid the destruction and loss of manpower associated with World War I certainly didn't hurt. The war helped catapult the U.S. from being a debtor nation to a creditor one, and Wilson's leading role in the negotiations at Versailles, even though he didn't actually get what he wanted, made America a big player on the world stage for the first time.
So we don't get completely Eurocentric, another major outcome of the war was the end of the Ottoman Empire and the emergence of the nation-state of Turkey. The rest of the world saw some change too, but not much for the better. In Africa, Britain took Germany's colonies, and even though Indians fought and died in a higher percentage than Americans in World War I, India didn't gauge any real autonomy.
All these terrible outcomes led to a general sense of disappointment in literary circles, and this feeling of pointlessness and cynicism was expressed by the writers of the Lost Generation. It was a war full of loss. Millions of people were lost. Traditional ideals of war's nobility and heroism were lost as well. After World War I, war might be necessary, but it would never be glorious again. We see this shift in the writing and art that emerged from the Great War as artists transitioned from Romanticism to Modernism.